Okay, what we're going to take a look at in this particular lesson is we need to get some data into our database, and we want to do this the most lazy, efficient way that I can personally think of. And what we're going to do is generate some JSON data and then use that to insert data into the database. And what we'll use to help us with this, we'll just go across to Google, and what we're going to look for is a tool called JSON Generator. And this is what we want, www.json-generator.com, a tool for generating random data. Exactly what we need for our application. So if we take a look at this, then we can see the kind of facility that this offers us. Now you may get a warning popping up saying, do you want to use the newest version? I'd suggest not, because you would need to then create an account, and this one is perfectly fine for what we need to do. Now, what this offers us, it offers us some repeating data, and it can repeat between 5 and 7 times in this case. And then we've got different fields. It can create different types of random data and all sorts of different options inside here. And if we just click on the Generate button, then we can see the kind of thing that it gives us. Pretty cool. Now, what we'll do is we'll use our own app user class, or the properties inside our app user class. We're going to use those on the left hand side to generate data for ourselves. Now this tool is particularly fussy on the syntax, so I'm not brave enough to type this out directly whilst we're looking at this, but what I do have, inside the student assets folder, we have a file called jsongenerator.txt. So let's open this one up. And what this gives us is the syntax for what we need for our application. So I'm just going to copy this into the clipboard, and then I'll explain what's going on inside this tool after I've pasted this in. So what we've got here is this is going to repeat 5 times, and we've got our username property, which is set to a random first name for a female. We'll set the gender to female. We'll give it a random date of birth between 1950 and 1999. We're then going to set the known as to the same as the username, and that's what this function does for us. We'll give it a random created date and a later random last active date. So we pass in 2 date properties inside here between 2019 and the end of, or the first half of 2020. We're going to give them a date for when the profile was created, and then we're going to say their last active between a random date between these time periods. We're going to use lorem ipsum for the introduction, the lock-in for, and the interests, and we're going to generate a random city and a random country. And also what we're going to use for the photos, and I'm just going to take the opportunity in here to update this to a capital U and a capital I for the URL property and the isMain property. We can get around this in our code, but it's just easier. It'll save us writing another line of code by just making these 2 properties title case, just like all of the other properties inside here. Now what we're doing for the photo URL is we're using a random user API, and we're just going to select a random photo between 1 and 99. This has 100 photos for males and 100 photos for females, and we're going to set the photo isMain to true for all of these. So what we can do is we can click on generate, and then this is going to give us a list of random users with all of the properties that we need inside there for our username, gender, date of birth, known as, created, last active, introduction, and we've got our photo generated here as well. Now sometimes this gives us some really weird names, so what I typically do is I just keep on clicking generate until I've got some short, easy to remember names that I can make use of in the application. So just skip through until you're comfortable with some of the name that they've given you. I'm looking for a 4-letter first name for the first one, and until I find it, I don't stop. Lisa, that's easy for me to remember, so is Karen, and Margot, this seems fine to me. So what I'm going to do is copy the JSON to the clipboard and head over to VS Code, and inside the API, inside the data folder, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call this user seed data.json. and press return and just paste in the contents of my clipboard inside here, and we've got our JSON data for all of our user properties, and they match what we've got inside our app user class. So it's going to be easy for us to get the data translated into a C# object or our app user entity so that we can use that to seed our data. So we've got 5 female users in here. What we'll do, we'll just go across and get 5 male users as well. So we'll change the first name to types of first name that are male. We'll change the gender to male, and what we'll also do is change the photo from women to men in the URL here, and then we'll just do the same thing again. We'll just generate, or keep clicking generate until we've got easy to remember names. And this will suffice. Todd is easy enough for me to remember, and so is Porter. So I'm just going to copy this JSON to the clipboard and head back to VS Code, and what we want to do is underneath our female users, just before the closing square bracket, we'll just add a comma, and then we'll paste in what we have here, and we'll remove this square bracket at the end, and we'll scroll up until we get to the top of our male users, and we'll also remove this square bracket here and reformat, and now we've got a list of 10 users that match the properties inside our database. So what we'll take a look at next is how we can actually take this data and get it into our database, and we'll take a look at that next. Okay, now we've got some seed data to work with. What we're going to take a look at now is how we get this into our database. So what we'll do is inside the data folder, we're going to create a new class called seed, and what we'll do is we'll write the logic so that we can get the data out of that JSON file and into our database. So what we'll do is we'll create a static method inside here so that we don't need to create a new instance of this class to use the method that we're going to create. And this is going to be asynchronous. We'll create an async task, and we're going to say seed users as the name of the method. Now we're going to need to pass our data context into this. So we'll add this as a parameter, and we'll also bring in system threading tasks inside here as well. By the way, we're returning effectively void from this, so we're not giving our task any type parameter, but this will still give us asynchronous functionality even though we're returning void, or not returning anything, I should say. So what we'll do is, first of all, we want to check to see if our users table contains any users. So what we can do there is we can say if await and context.users, and then we'll say any async, and we'll return from this if we do have any users, and we'll need to bring in Microsoft Entity Framework Core to use that function. Now if we continue, that means we do not have any users in our database, and we want to go and interrogate that file to see what we have inside there and store it in a variable. So we're going to say var user data equals await and then system.io .file, and what we want to do is say read all text async, and then we want to get the location of the JSON file that we've created. So I'm going to say user seed data.json. In fact, I stand corrected. This should be data / user seed data.json, and double check that this matches exactly with what we've called the file in Solution Explorer. Easy to make a mistake here, and it won't work obviously if you point to the wrong file. Then what I'm going to say is var users equals, and I'm going to say JSON serializer because we want to get the JSON out of this, and there's two options here, but we're going to use system text JSON. This has been available since .NET 3, and we no longer need to use Newtonsoft.json, which has been around for so many years, but Microsoft have finally created a version of this that we can use natively inside .NET Core, and it should perform a bit better than Newtonsoft as well. So we'll use the system.text option for JSON, and what we want to do here is deserialize what's inside the user data here. This is going to be a string of JSON text and we want to deserialize that into an object. And what we want to do is specify a list and app user, and then we pass in our user data into this method. And we'll need to bring in system collections generic for our list, and we'll also need to bring in API entities for our app user. Now at this stage, our users should be a normal list of users of type app user. We should have it out of the JSON file by this point. And then what we can do is say for each, and then we'll say for var user in users, and then we can go and add them to our database just as we're doing in our register component. We still need passwords for these, which we'll hard code and we'll create them, but we also need to use the password salt and the password hash. So what we'll do is we'll say using var hmac equals new hmac char and then 512, and we'll need to bring in system security cryptography. And then we can say that our user.username is equal to user.username, and we want this in lowercase, so we'll use to lower. Then we'll say user.password hash equals hmac.compute hash, and we'll say encoding, and use system.text, and then we'll say UTF-8, and then we'll say get bytes, and what we'll do is hard code the password in here. So I'm going to say PA$W0RD as the password for all of these users. Now please don't forget this is seed data that we're using for developing our app. We want to see what our app is like when we've got users inside it. But these are not real users, and we would never create users in this way where we hard code passwords in there. We don't want to generate random passwords in our seed data because then it's going to be a nightmare to use and log in with these different users. We want a consistent password that we know what it is so that we can log in with any of these users, and this should be a semicolon rather than a comma. So then we need our password salt, and that's just going to be hmac.key, and then what we can say is await context.users, and we can say add and then user. And we don't need to await this method because when we're adding, all we're doing, don't forget, is adding tracking to the user through Entity Framework. We're not doing anything with a database at this point. What we are doing with a database is after this, after we've looped through all of the users, then what we need to do is say await and then context and say save changes async. So this is our seed method, and we've got a parameter here for our data context. So where do we actually do this? Where do we call this method from? Well, the current recommended place is in the program.cs class. And this does change periodically. Microsoft changed their recommendations, but where we start our application is a fine place to seed data because we're going to do this inside the main method, and what goes on inside here happens before our application is actually started. So what we're going to do is adjust the main method inside here. Now we're going to remove the run from this, and what we're going to do is assign this method to a variable and say var host equals this. And what we're also going to do is change this to an async method. So instead of returning void, we're going to return async and task, and then we're going to complete the logic for this. So what we need to do is get our service, our data context service, so that we can pass it to our seed method. And what we do for this, we say using var scope equals and then host.services and create scope. And let's see if we can bring this in. This doesn't normally work, but it has this time. We need to bring in Microsoft Extensions dependency injection to make use of this method. So what we're doing here is creating a scope for the services that we're going to create in this part, and make sure we've got this extension brought in. And after this, what we're going to do is say var services equals scope.service provider. And when we're in the main method inside the program class, we're outside of our middleware. So even though we've spent a bunch of time setting up a global exception handler, we don't have access to it in this method. So what we do need to do here is write a try catch block so that we can catch any exceptions that happen during the seeding of our data. So we'll add the try catch block, and in the try block what we're going to do is say var context equals, and we're going to say services and get required service, and then we're going to pass in our data context into this. And let's just bring in using API data. Then what we're going to do is say await context, and what we're going to do here is get the database, and we're going to migrate our database here. Now what this migrate async method does for us, let's take a look at its description. This asynchronously applies any pending migrations for the context to the database, and it will create the database if it does not already exist. So what we're doing here, and this is for our convenience, is what we've been doing so far is using .NET EF database update. What we're going to do in future is just restart our application to apply any migrations. And what this also means, if we drop our database, then all we need to do is restart our application and our database will be recreated. And also what we're going to do here is say await seed, and we need to get our seed method here, which we have access to, and then call the seed users method and pass in the context. And what we'll also do is in the exception we're going to get access to our logger, so we're going to say var logger equals services and get required service, and we're going to get the iLogger, and we'll pass in the program class as its type. And what we'll do, if we get an error, we'll say logger and log error, and we'll pass in the exception, and we'll just say an error occurred during migration. And very importantly, this is easy to miss as well, we removed the run command from this method, and we need to make sure we call it after we've finished doing what we're doing here. So below the try catch block, what we're going to do is say host, and then we can use the run async method inside there, or more appropriately we can say await host run async. So now we've got the building blocks in place, what we'll do next is test what we've done and make sure we get data in our database. Okay, now we've done the work to generate JSON data, we've created a seed class, and we've got a way now for us to seed our data into our database. So what we need to do now is we need to drop our existing database, so make sure that we've got our API server stopped, and what we'll do is we'll say .NET EF database drop and press return, and we'll get the confirmation and we'll say yes. And all we need to do now, based on the work that we've done, is simply restart our application. So I'm going to say .NET Watch run and press return, and cross fingers that there's no errors in the console when we do this. And we can see that a fair amount has been going on. We can see insert into, lots of inserts, which is good, and we're not seeing any errors inside here. So I'm fairly optimistic that this has worked successfully. So what we'll do is we'll take a look at our database, and we'll just open up SQLite Explorer, and we'll just refresh this, make sure we're getting the latest version. And I'm just going to right click and show table for the users, and I can see if I put the tab over here, I can see that I've got a list of 10 users now. Please don't worry about the password hash and password salt. They're not meant for you because you're a human and you can't read that stuff. And then we've got our cities, we've got our created dates, dates of birth, we've got our genders populated, we've got the interests, we've got the text for the introduction, we've got the known as, the last active, and this one's for the looking for. So that looks good. All of that data has populated inside our database there. Let's take a look at the photos table, make sure this also is populated. And we can see that we've got our 10 images. Don't worry about the public ID, that's supposed to be null at this stage. And we can see that each one of them has its corresponding app user ID inside the app user ID column there as well. So we're looking pretty good. Let's go and see what happens now when we go and get our users from a database. But first of all, let's just go back to our users controller, because I can't remember if I turned off the attributes to allow anonymous and authorize inside here. And I didn't. But what we want to do here is remove these from here, or the allow anonymous from here. And what we'll do is, because we do want authentication on our users controller, whenever a user goes to get a user or get all of the users, then we want them to authenticate. So what we'll do is we'll put this at the top of this class and say authorize. So all of the methods inside this controller now are going to be protected with authorization. So let's go across to Postman and test these different endpoints. And if we take a look at section 8, and one reason you might want to use the same seed data as myself is that I've already populated these requests with the users that we're using. Only one of them though, and just the first user in the list, Lisa, is the one that I'll use the majority of the testing for. And in the body of this request we can see the username is Lisa, and we've got the correct password there as well. Now this method I've called login as Lisa and save token to the env. What we can do with Postman is we can add tests to it, and let's take a look at the test inside here. So what we can do is get the response inside Postman, and that's what this is, pm.response.json, and we're storing the response inside this variable, this const of user. And we can add a test to this and tell Postman that we expect this user to have a property called username and a property called token. And if it does have these properties, then we're going to set the global token to user.token. And what this means is that when we receive a token back from our API, we're going to store this token. And if we take a look at the getUsers method inside the headers, then we've got the authorization header already set up and the bearer and the token that's going to go up there. So when we log in, we're effectively logging in with Postman, and we're saving the token inside Postman so that we can use it in our other requests inside the header. So this is quite a cool trick when you're working with authentication and you want to quickly and easily test it. So when we do log in, and let's just give this a go, and I'll log in, and we get the success, and we've now got a token in our response. So what we can take a look at, if we look at this next to the environment, what we have here is our environment quick look, and we can see that we have a token, and this token is going to exactly match the token inside here, and we're going to use this token to go and get our users. So let's click on the next request now that we have the token, and like I say, if you do use a different username to myself, then please make sure you update the username, otherwise you're going to get a 401 unauthorized. The easy way to make sure you're doing the same as what I'm doing is in the user seed data.json. I've also supplied this inside the student assets, and if you did want to stick with using the same users as mine, then just replace your users in here with the data that I provided for you. All you'd need to do then, if you've already seeded your data, is simply drop your database and then restart your application, and you'll be seeded with the same information that I'm using here. So let's go and get our users. Now I'm expecting to see a strange response for this, because what we're still doing at the moment is returning our user entities. But let's click on send anyway to see what happens. So we do get a 200 OK. What we're still doing at the moment is returning our password hash and salt. I'm sure I promised that we'd stop doing this at some point, and that point is not far away. We've got our created, last active, gender, etc. and we see null for the photos. And the result is actually fine. Because of the way that we're returning this data, we're not going to see an error here, and that is successful. And if we take a look at getting a user by a username, then we're going to get a not found at this point, because we haven't set our application up yet to use usernames rather than the ID to go and get a user. So this functionality we haven't added yet anyway. But what we do have now is data. in our database, which is good. Now we've got something to work with. What we're going to take a look at next is slightly redesigning the architecture of our application, and we're going to take a look at the repository pattern.